Yo, what's happening, guys? It's GM Cody back this week with another video, another role-playing game review, and also a bit of a celebration because it is the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons. And so, in order to celebrate the 50th anniversary, I thought, what better way than talk about where it all started and go back to 1974, and we're going to take a look at the original Dungeons and Dragons, the white box. We're not just going to look at the white box. In the next coming weeks, we're going to look through all the materials of the original Dungeons & Dragons. We're going to look at all the supplements. We're going to look at chainmail. We're going to look at the whole shebang and really give it a good, proper overview. And also give my opinions on it and why I think this is actually still a great game and still very playable today. So, yeah, so that's what we're going to be talking about. And tonight we're going to be talking specifically about men and magic. Now, I should say, so if you bought the white box back in the day, which originally was a brown box, of course. The original printing was a wood grain box, but it soon moved to these white boxes. Now, back in the day, the original set came with 3 booklets. Came with Men and Magic, The Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, and Monsters and Treasure. Now, you can pretty much guess what all these kind of equate to in the modern day D&D format that they still hold today. Of course, Men and Magic would be the equivalent of our Player's Handbook today. And of course, Monsters and Treasure would be the equivalent of the Monsters Manual. Of course, this does have the treasures in it as well. And then the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures would be like the equivalent of our Dungeon Master's Guide, right? And so that's kind of what these 3 books were all about that came in the original set. Now, of course, later on, they started releasing supplements. Now, I don't have all the supplements, but I have quite a few of them. Supplement 2 was Dave Arneson's Blackmore. Supplement 3, Eldritch Wizardry, written by Guy Gex and Bloom. And then Supplement 1, which we didn't do this in order, was Gary Gygax and Rob Kuntz, Greyhawk. And we're going to take a look at those too. And of course, there was like a Demigods, Gods and Heroes supplement, which I do not have, and Swords and Spells as well, which is more of a war game, but a lot of people consider that part of the core books of original D&D, and also Chainmail, which I do not own a real physical version of Chainmail either, but we're going to take a look at it regardless. So, yeah, that's the core books. And again, tonight we're going to look at Men and Magic. I'm going to discuss it with you. We're going to talk about why I think this game is a great and playable game and still worth your attention today. And, it's still a special, not just a piece of history and cool to have on the shelf, but it's actually worth checking out today and worth playing. But before we go into all that, of course, I got to tell you how I was introduced to original Dungeons and Dragons. So, I've talked about it many times. I started playing D&D in the 90s with 2nd edition AD&D, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Now, soon after, I got really interested in the history of D&D, and I get that way about everything, right? Anything I get really into, I want to know where it came from. I want to know everything about it. And, D&D and any of the role-playing games I was playing at the time, it was no exception. So I started going back in time, right? One of the neighbor kids I used to play D&D with, his whole family played D&D, and I've told this story before. But his dad, played D&D back when it first came out, basically. And he still played AD&D, 1st edition, with the whole family. And so he was the first one that got that in my mind that there were other versions of D&D. He showed me, that guy's dad showed me the AD&D 1st edition books, which sometime we'll look at those as well. And I got really fascinated by it, and of course he let me borrow them, and we started playing, or attempting to play AD&D 1st edition. I kind of talked the gaming group at that time into playing 1st edition. I was running 1st edition, and BX too. I should mention that I discovered BX by myself, found it used at the game store. And a few years later, I discovered that there was this other version of D&D I didn't know about, which is the original version. So I acquired some illicit PDFs of it, of course, back then, and started pouring through this thing, and was really fascinated by what I saw, because it was it just had a very different tone and flavor and feel from the D&D that I started with, the AD&D first or second edition. So I got really enamored by it, but I never thought I would actually get to talk anybody into playing it. It looked, well, I won't lie, AD or D&D, the original version, can look really unwieldy and intimidating if you don't have somebody to tell you what you're looking at, right? And it was no exception for me. I thought it looked like an unplayable mess when I first saw it, but it was fascinating nonetheless. Now, skip ahead to my 20s. My love of old school D&D just got stronger, right? And I really started looking, very hardcore at the original D&D, and I stumbled upon the original Dungeons and Dragons forums, which are still active, by the way. You can go there, and those guys are that's the best community of people that I know of that still play original D&D and discuss it, and there's a lot of good ideas going on there. So around that time, and this is the time when the OSR movement was just starting to kick off, I got really hot and heavy on wanting to actually learn and how to play original D&D. So I went on these forums and read all I could and asked all the questions I could. And of course, it was through those forums that I met some cool people, and that's where I acquired this. And they gave, this is not the greatest copy or anything. It's beat up and it's a little stained, but the books are in good shape and everything. And I didn't pay a lot of money for it because those guys knew I was legitimately interested in learning about this and wanting to play it. And so during that time, I got really into playing original D&D and was running original D&D for my groups. And for other people, other groups, and online, I was playing it online and running people through it, and I got really, really into the idea of original D&D and really saw and felt the magic of it. And so, hopefully, after we go through all this, maybe you guys will pique your interest will be piqued about original D&D, and you'll go look for it for yourselves. Now, of course, you can acquire this legally through Drive-Thru RPG, and you can make your own booklets, which is really easy to do, and it wouldn't take you a lot of printer paper to do it. But there's other options too, which did not get off the shelf, but I think most of you guys are aware of it. The best option, I would say, if you didn't want to play from the old manuals, is Gore's Swords and Wizardry. Now, Swords and Wizardry is pretty close to original D&D. It's not exact. There are some differences. There's a lot of differences, but it's still got the feel and the flavor of original D&D, I would say. And Swords and Wizardry core is all the original D&D supplements and all the materials meshed together in one nice rule book. And of course, there's a new version out that I do have a copy of, and someday we'll take a look at the new version of Swords and Wizardry. But I think a better option, actually, if you really want to get the flavor of original D&D, is the Swords and Wizardry white box, because it only uses the 3 core books from the white box. And in my opinion, that is where you're really going to get the biggest differences from original D&D compared to every other version of D&D. Because if you're playing original D&D with all the supplements, it starts to feel a lot like AD&D First Edition, because that's pretty much what AD&D First Edition was a culmination, a compilation of all these materials put into one nice, or 3 big hardback books, and with some stuff added in, of course, and of course stuff added in from the Strategic Review and Dragon Magazine, and of course new rules that Gary Gygax and his team came up with. So yeah, that's my 2 cents about, if you're interested in what I have to say here and you want to look into it for yourself, you can either acquire the original versions, of course, and there's ways to do that legally or otherwise, and you can also acquire Swords and Wizardry, which I think is a really good option if you want a pretty close approximation of what OD&D, the real OD&D, is all about. So without further ado, let's take a look at Min and Magic, shall we? So here we are, Dungeons & Dragons. I'm going to blow this up a little bit so you guys can see it better. Dungeons & Dragons rules for fantastic medieval war games, campaigns playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures. By Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. Of course, this is, I think, only the second or third book in TSR history that actually has Dave, Arneson's name on it. So that's interesting. And if I didn't mention it before, I can't remember if I did at the beginning of the video. Some of my old-time viewers might be like, Cody, you've already done this before, and you're actually absolutely correct. I have done this before. But we're doing it again because, I was not really ever quite happy with what I did originally on my overview of original D&D. I think we could do better. Also, I never finished that. I never went through all the supplements and everything. So we're starting over again, all right? We're starting over. And so, if you've already seen this video, basically, you're welcome to skip it. But, hey, we're doing it. We're doing it again, all right? We're doing it live. So Min and Magic is volume 1 of the 3 booklets. Of course, everybody knows the history of how this game came about. I'm not going to go through that too much. Maybe in some other video we will. Here's the foreword by Gary Gygax, which we're not going to read about, but he's basically talking about the origins of how Dave Arneson brought him. Basically he's talking about Dave Arneson's Blackmore campaign and how he got to play in that campaign, and that's where they came up with the idea for Dungeons and Dragons and everything. And he's talking about all that and the wargamers and all that kind of jazz. Now you have to remember, at this time, of course, this is the original role-playing game. So at that time, they didn't really know what to call it. So there was many different names going around, adventure games, and there were a lot of names being jumbled around. But in the end, what they settled on was a war game. Which this is not a war game, all right? But at the time, that seemed probably like the most marketable thing, because they figured that the people that were going to be buying this game were war gamers, because they were and that's what they were marketing this towards, is the wargaming crowd. And of course, there was no role-playing crowd. There was no such thing really as a pen and paper tabletop role-playing games. So this is the first one. Introduction, and here we have some cool, very primitive art. And I don't know who did all this art, to be honest with you. It's all done by different people that were working for TSR, at the time, which there weren't many of them at this time, just a handful. So I don't know who did all these, and some of these are actually like bootleg pieces that like some teenager did from comic books and stuff, which I do know a little bit about that. So the introduction is just telling you what you need. It's telling you that this is a very different game, that it's all in your imagination, and you do not actually need miniature figures or a board, and that you have a referee. It kind of gives you an idea of what you're doing. Now, it doesn't really do a good job at explaining everything about it. But later on, there is a example of play that gives a better understanding of how this game's actually played. But it does set the tone right off the bat, if you were reading this in 1974, that this is a very different game from all the other, war games that you're used to. And of course, it says, it tells you about what all the different volumes and stuff are. And we get into more introductory material here. The scope. This is where it tells you what you need and everything. And like I was telling you about it, just paper, pencil, and map boards are standard. Miniature figures can be added, etc., etc. But it makes a strong statement to say that you do not need figures to play with this game. Of course, ages 12 and up. Number of players. This is kind of interesting, and I brought this up last time. At least one referee, and from 4 to 50 players can be handled in any single campaign, but the referee to player ratio should be about 1 to 20 or thereabouts. Now, this seems like an insane number to us today. But back then, you got to remember these first groups that Gary and Dave and Rob Kuntz and all these guys were playing with were big groups, right? Like it was big groups of people because this was a new phenomenon. Everybody wanted in on it. And so they were running these huge crowds of their, basically made up of their wargaming clubs. And so I guess this seemed about normal for them. And they thought this probably be normal for every other wargame club. I think they assumed that wargame clubs were the ones that were going to be playing this, and you could just run the whole wargame club, right? But I think quickly, everybody realized once you play any kind of role-playing game that 20 people is a little too unwieldy, right? 4 to 8 is probably more acceptable, but it is kind of funny here. 4 to 50 players could be handled, which, don't get me wrong, I've handled 20 something odd players at a time, but man, what a nightmare. And ironically enough, I did that at a convention running original D&D. Recommended equipment, Dungeons & Dragons, you have it, of course, the white box. Outdoor survival, which is what they recommend you use for your wilderness map. Now, later on, I don't think most people used outdoor survival. I think, some people did. I've heard some people actually did go buy outdoor survival, and some people quickly realized that they could just make up their own maps. And I think by the time Judges Guild came around and started making all their wilderness of high adventure and all that stuff, people saw that there were other options for making wilderness maps, and they could actually create worlds and stuff like that. And of course, these guys were already doing that, of course, with Dave Arneson's Blackmore and Gary Gygax's Greyhawk and whatnot. They were already creating their own worlds and own maps, but they somewhere down the line, I don't really know the story of this actually, but I'm sure one of you guys might or whatever, where the idea for the outdoor survival, I think it was Gary that was using it in his first campaign, because he didn't, he, instead of drawing a map, he had this game and he just used the map from that, which is a really, clever idea, and it does work. Interestingly enough, I have actually played outdoor survival, which is made by the Avalon Hill game, and we talked about, one of the Avalon Hill games a couple weeks ago, which is Squad Leader. But me and one of my online friends, who's an enthusiast of original D&D, and he knows who he is. Hey, Dave, if you're watching. A few years ago, we actually sat down with a couple other friends and got to play not D&D, but we played outdoor survival, and it's actually a pretty fun little game, and the map's really cool. And there's somebody online that made a supplement of their own to use outdoor survival, and they made a actual campaign world, a real playable campaign world out of outdoor survival, the outdoor survival map. So, it's definitely usable, but not needed, right? Dice, of course, all the typical D&D dice that we all know. 4-sider, 20-sider, 8-sider, 12-sider, and 4 to 20 pairs of 6-sided dice. Chainmail, of course, the miniature war games rules that Gary Gygax co-wrote, and of course that Dave Arneson used for inspiration for his Blackmore campaigns. Now, chainmail you don't necessarily have to have, but they assume you're going to use chainmail to fill in a lot of the gaps in here, and they're going to reference chainmail a lot, but you actually don't need it per se. You could fill in the gaps yourself, and that's what a lot of people, I think, did back then and still do today. But you can use chainmail, and we'll get into that when we look at the chainmail references. Preparation for the campaign, and basically what they're going to tell you to do is to draw a dungeon, which is what they assumed you would do right from the get-go. Of course, later on, games quickly broke out of the dungeons, I think, within a few years. And people were exploring the world and the wilderness, and it does have rules for wilderness exploration and stuff like that. So this is not just solely a dungeon delving game, right? And, within a few years of this game coming out, or even probably sooner, people were doing other stuff besides just going into dungeons. But of course, that was the key thing they thought you were going to be doing, and that everybody wanted to do, was go down into mega dungeons into the underworld, as they call it, looking for treasure and fighting monsters and all that stuff. So here we go into the actual rules. So right off the bat, starts talking about character classes. Now, in the original D&D white box, there is only 3 character classes, and those are the fighting man, the magic user, and the cleric. And that's it. There's no thief in the original D&D, and there's no other classes either. Thief will not be introduced until Greyhawk, and of course the other classes are introduced in the supplements and in the strategic reviews, which we'll look at in the next coming weeks. So fighting man, of course, includes the characters of elves and dwarves and even hobbits. Hobbits are mentioned in this version, but they are not mentioned in my printings, I don't think. And of course, the original printings of D&D, I think the first 4 or 5 printings, something around there, had a lot of Tolkien references in them. So they mentioned hobbits and Ents and Balrogs, and of course the Tolkien estate, threatened to file a lawsuit, or maybe even filed one. I'm not sure on the exact details. And in the next coming printings, they had to take all those elements out. Now, in some little parts, they left little things in. They missed things. So, in certain parts, I think in one of my books, it still mentions hobbits somewhere and things like that. But for the most part, they had to take all that stuff out. But in this printing, whichever printing this is, it still mentions the hobbits here. So anyways, fighting men can be elves, dwarves, and hobbits. Magic users can be men and elves, and clerics are limited to men only. All non-human players are restricted in some aspects and gifted in others. This will be dealt with in the paragraphs pertaining in each non-human type. So let's talk about the classes. So fighting man is the fighter, right? This is the classic fighter. They can use any weapons. They have the most hit dice. And of course, later on when they level up, they are able to become barons and lords and, build a keep and all that stuff. Just like in AD&D. Magic users, exactly like what you think magic users in later versions of D&D. They're the weakest character class, or they start off the weakest character class. They have the lowest amount of hit points, but they get spells. Now, of course, it's the same tradition as we still, I guess we still don't know and love, but, that we knew and loved for a long time, is that magic users did not get a lot of spells. They started off very weak, and it took them a long time to power up, but once they leveled up and got to certain levels, they became the most powerful characters in the game, of course. So, it tells you about magic users and that they can manufacture scrolls. And here's all the stuff they can, they can make magic items, and here's example prices for making magic items. And they can also research, and of course, research their own spells and write their own scrolls. And it actually gives spaces, which they go into more detail about coming up with your own spells at the end of the book, at the end of the Men in Magic book, I believe. And in the magic section, there's actually blank sections where you're supposed to write in the spells that you created. So anyways, clerics. Clerics are the classic cleric that we all know and love. It says they have the advantages of 2 classes, the fighting man and magic users. So that's kind of true. They're worse at fighting than a magic user, but than a fighting man, but not as good as a magic user. But they can use any armor and any non-edged weapons. Now, it is interesting to note that in all these descriptions of weapons and armor, it mentions magical weapons and armor. And one important thing to note about original D&D is it is not totally clear on a lot of things, and you have to make up your own interpretations about these things. And that's part of the fun of original D&D, I think. And so in this instance, there are some people that say this doesn't pertain to mundane armor and weapons, but just magic armor and weapons. So that's just one example. But I think most people make the assumption what that means. And that's what I assume, is that it means any kind of armor or weapons, not just magic armor and weapons. And I think there's a reason, they mention like magic weapons and armors, because there's not a lot of different types of armor. And in original D&D, of course, all weapons deal the same amount of damage, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So anyways, I'm just going to point out some little oddities here and there, and some little caveats and things that still get discussed about to this day about original D&D, and people, still make their own house rules and interpretations of. So then here we start talking about the different demi-human races. Of course, we got the dwarf, and we have this awesome illustration of the dwarf. This is actually a really cool one. I like this one. The dwarf can only be a fighting man, and they can never advance beyond 6th level. So they have level limits, and the level limits are quite low, as you can tell, compared to later versions of D&D. They have high level of magic resistance, and thus add 4 levels when rolling saving throws. They are the only characters able to fully employ the +3 magic hammer. They note slanting passages, traps, shifting walls, and new construction underground settings, which I think this is described in the wilderness guide. And they are able to speak the languages of gnomes, kobolds, and goblins, in addition to the usual tongues. And of course, see languages in this volume. Elves. So elves are a little bit more complicated, and still a hot topic of debate in original D&D. So we're going to read through this a little bit. So elves can begin as either fighting men or magic users, and freely switch class whenever they choose from adventure to adventure, but not during the course of a single game. Thus, they gain the benefits of both classes and may use both weaponry and spells. They may use magic armor and still act as magic users. However, they may not progress beyond 4th level fighting man nor 8th level magic user. Of course, they have other abilities. Elves are more able to note secret and hidden doors. They also gain the advantages noted in the chainmail rules when fighting certain fantastic creatures. Finally, elves are able to speak the languages of orcs, hobgoblins, and gnolls, in addition to their own language and the other usual tongues. So first off, I want to mention, here's our next, I think this is probably our first chainmail reference other than you need the book. And of course, it's telling you to go look up chainmail to figure out the rules that elves get. Now, there's a lot of rules that elves get in chainmail that you would have to extrapolate there, and not every game master uses everything written down there in chainmail. Some people give them all the abilities listed in chainmail. Some of them only give them the abilities against fantastic creatures, which they get, a bonus to hit against werewolves and ghouls and all kinds of stuff. And so, it's just another point of interpretation, really, and however you feel like running your game. Now, this is a really big point of contention here, is elves can begin as either fighting men or magic users, and freely switch class whenever they choose from adventure to adventure. So basically the way this is reading is that you start as either a fighting man or a magic user, or I guess they start at both, but you choose which class you're adventuring as during that adventure, and then after the adventure you can switch to the other class, which is very interesting. Now, people tend to house rule this a lot. This is a very common thing that a lot of OD&D players house rule. I've seen where basically most people combine both together, and they're basically a multi-class, or they can choose one or the other. So there's a lot of different interpretations for this. And this is one of the most common things that gets house ruled in original D&D, and in fact, this is something I house rule most frequently. I either let elves begin as a fighter, a magic user, or they can be a combination of both and be a multi-class character, kind of like what the BX elf is. And some people do the multi-class and give them more restrictions, like they can only wear chainmail instead of, plate and stuff like that. But it's totally up to you, and that's one of the cool things about White Box D&D, in my opinion, is it's very, very simple game, so it's very easy to come up with your own, to house rule things and not break the game, but also add to the game if you want to. You can add on layers, and it's not going to break the game either. So I think that's a big benefit and one of the cool things about OD&D. And if you start getting into OD&D, it becomes something you start doing quite quickly, and it can become kind of a rabbit hole, actually, making up house rules for, original D&D. But anyways, halflings. Should any player wish to be one, you'll be limited to the fighting man class as a halfling. Halflings cannot progress above the 4th level, but they will have magic resistance equal to dwarves, and they have deadly accuracy with missiles as detailed in Chainmail. Of course, another Chainmail reference telling you to go look up the rules there. This is a very interesting one, and something that I see get brought up in a lot of modern D&D discussions, but this goes right back to the original version of D&D, straight from the horse's mouth here. Gary Gygax says, other character types, there is no reason that players cannot be allowed to play as virtually anything, provided they begin relatively weak and work up to the top, i.e. if a player wishing to be a dragon would have to begin as, let's say, a young one and progress upwards in the usual manner, steps being predetermined by the campaign referee. So he's saying that, with permission of your game master, there's no reason why a player couldn't play any kind of monster, they mention a dragon here, which is, whatever. But that is a really interesting thing that this, and this topic gets brought up a lot nowadays about modern D&D, but this goes all the way back to the original version of D&D. So, character alignment. So if you're familiar with the basic expert version, or BECMI, or old school essentials, which is BX, this has a lot of the same. This has a lot of the same kind of feel that BX does. That's because BX D&D was literally just a reformatting of this. But the alignment system is the same in original D&D as you would see in BX and BECMI and such. And there's only 3 alignments, and that's law, neutrality, and chaos. And here they have an alignment chart listing off different kinds of creatures that fall under those alignments. And then finally we get to determination of abilities. Oh, there is rules here for changing character class, which is not something I ever see people talk about doing, but it is mentioned in here. While changing class for other than elves is not recommended, the following rules should be applied. In order for men to change class, they must have a score of 16 or better in the prime requisite of the class they wish to change to, and this score must be unmodified. A cleric with a strength of 15, for example, could not become a fighting man. In any event, magic users cannot become clerics and vice versa. And that's all it has to say on it. But, there is kind of little recommendations there if you want to use rules for changing classes. Determination of ability scores. Of course, we have the classic ability score line up here. We have strength, which, let's highlight these. We have strength, intelligence, wisdom, constitution, dexterity, and charisma. And of course, it recommends just rolling 3 6-sided dice the classic way for each ability score, and that's what you would get. And of course, we don't really have to explain too much about the ability scores. I think we all know what these mean. But the really interesting thing about ability scores in original D&D is they do not matter that much. There are not many bonuses in original D&D across the board. And this applies as well to the ability scores. You do not get a lot of bonuses for really high ability scores, and you don't get a lot of penalties for low ability scores, which I think is not a bad thing in itself, because everybody's always looking for the highest ability scores in modern D&D, but in even AD&D, right, you're always looking for like a 15 or more to get that bonus. But in original D&D, it matters not that much, but a high ability score still does matter, and it just doesn't matter as much, I would say. And bonuses are rare overall, right? So, your prime requisite for your class will give you an experience point bonus, either 10% or 5%. You can also get a penalty if your scores are low. Constitution of 15 or more will give you +1 to hit points. And of course, lower Constitution will give you a lower chance of surviving, like a really deadly blow. This is system shock, essentially, is what this is. And of course, Constitution of 6 or less, you get -1 from each hit die. A dexterity above 12 gives you a +1 to fire with missiles. Dexterity under 9 gives you fire any missile at -1. Average scores are indicated to be from 9 to 12. So that kind of anything under a 9 is considered, under average. And you can see here there's not a lot of bonuses and penalties, right? And they're very small increments of bonuses and penalties. So, like I was saying, that's the case here. Now, this is another thing that's commonly house ruled, and a lot of OD&D game masters regularly add in their own bonuses and penalties. And of course, we'll see later on in the supplements, they start adding in more and more, fiddling around with more bonuses and stuff that would eventually become what you would see more clearly in AD&D. But this is something that commonly gets house ruled. Languages, you get a bonus language for every point of intelligence above 10. Non-player characters. Of course, also it tells you here how you roll up your gold. Same as BX, you roll 3d6 times 10, and that's how many gold pieces you have. And charisma gives you a reaction bonus and a loyalty bonus, and it tells you how many hirelings you can hire. But it also gives you a reaction bonus, as we're going to see here, trying to hire NPCs and hirelings. And you would roll 2d6 and add your bonus to see what your reaction would be interacting with that NPC. And of course, this could be used for any kind of like social interactions, and this is what I usually regularly do when playing original D&D. Here it's talking about, capturing monsters, of loyalty of NPCs, including monsters, which is really cool. And it's got a bit of a morale, a little bit of talk about morale here, and using chainmail for morale. Relatives, of course, this is a very old custom. If your character dies, and you can pass on your estate, your goods to your next character, but there's going to be a tax of 10% all your goods and equipment. So, Bob the dwarf number 2, or whatever, that common thing. Equipment, here's the equipment list, and it's pretty basic. And like I was telling you earlier, I kind of mentioned it, I think, is that weapons don't really matter because they all deal the same amount of damage, and they all deal 1 die of damage. So, that's how weapons work. And here's the encumbrance system based on gold pieces, which is carried on over to BX as well. And I think this is a very good encumbrance system, actually. Never had a problem with it. Of course, there's only 3 different types of armor. Like in BX, there's leather, chain, and plate. And shield will add to your armor class. And of course, helmets don't add to your armor class, but they could save your life depending on the situation. That's up to the referee. I did want to go back up here or maybe it's not mentioned yet, so we'll keep going. I will say weapon damage is another thing that gets commonly house ruled by a lot of OD&D players, and with me as well. A lot of people give two-handed weapons, maybe +1 damage, and smaller weapons like a dagger maybe -1 damage. I typically don't do that, but I do give +1 damage to two-handed weapons, just to make them, if you're sacrificing a shield, there should be some bonus, I think. So that's usually what my house rule is. But that is a house rule, but it's a very common one. So here we go. Levels and experience points needed to obtain them. So here we have the experience point charts and how many levels you can obtain. And it does talk about later on that theoretically there is no maximum level. This is my favorite art in the book, of course, is this barbarian. And if you hung around on the OD&D forums back in the day, you probably saw this guy as somebody's avatar, and that was me. So If you saw this guy, somebody's avatar floating around, that was definitely me. Of course, I don't frequent there anymore, unfortunately. I still stop by from time to time, see what's going on. Dice for cumulative hits. So hit points, all hit points in original D&D are 6-sided dice. And this is another thing that is kind of up for interpretation, and there's a lot of different interpretations in how this works. I'm going to talk about how my interpretation is of how the hit points work. So I think here it's telling you, right, how many hit dice you're going to roll. Now, some of these levels, though, you get +1 or whatnot added to. Where it gets interesting, of course, the fighting man's pretty straightforward and easy. But when you get to the magic user, it is staggered here. So, he starts off with 1 hit die, then he gets a 1 + 1, then he gets 2 hit dice, then he gets 2 + 1. So how I've always interpreted this is, of course, at first level, he gets 1 hit die. And at second level, he just adds +1 hit points, and that's it. And then at second level, he gets another hit die, or third level, he gets another hit die. Now, some people interpret this differently. Some people say that every combat, you roll all your hit dice together, and that's how many hit points you have for the combat. That's an interesting interpretation. I don't see it that way. Some people say that every level, when you level up, you re-roll your hit dice and take the highest result. And if it's lower than your current result, you don't gain any hit points. I don't see it that way either, but some people do these things, and it's just worth noting that this is something that gets interpreted very differently from everybody that plays original D&D. And this is also another thing that gets very commonly house ruled a lot. Some people drop this system altogether. What I've commonly done in the past, if I'm not using the hit dice system from the book, is I give fighters D6 + 1, clerics a D6, and magic users a D6 - 1. And that's a pretty simple way to do it, and it works really well. So anyways, just pointing out little oddities, right? So next to the hit dice, you'll see fighting capability, and what this is for the man-to-man combat system in Chainmail. And when we actually go look at Chainmail, I'll bring this up again. But this is for if you want to use the man-to-man system in Chainmail. If you're using the Chainmail combat system, of course, right off the bat in this book, it suggests using Chainmail, and at some point or another, we'll do a video. Maybe, I guess, some point or another around the time we're talking about Chainmail, I'll actually go through an in-depth discussion about how you can actually use Chainmail to play original D&D, which is not that complicated, but it's a lot more in-depth than just a little discussion, right? But that's what this is right here. But there is an alternate combat system described in here, which is basically the classic D20 THACO combat system that we're all, used to and know and love. So that gets introduced right off the bat in here, but it also suggests that you could use Chainmail. Spells and levels. So this is how many spells you get per level. Of course, a fighter doesn't get any. And, of course, here's the magic user, spell matrix, cleric, and, of course, clerics don't get any spells at first level, just like a BX cleric. Experience points. So it tells you, I think it's telling you here, just, how the experience points work and whatnot. I don't think it tells you how many, what you get experience points, how you get awarded experience points. I think that gets discussed elsewhere, but I'll discuss it now. So in the original D&D rules, 1 gold piece equals 1 experience point, and every hit die a monster has gives you 100 experience points. Now, I really like the 100 experience points per a hit die of a monster, and this is something I commonly use in every version of D&D I play because it's a very simple and elegant system. Of course, if the monster's a little tougher, I'll give them another 25 or 50, whatever I feel like. But I think it's a really nice, simple system that can be really useful to use even if you're not playing original D&D. Here it tells you how to add up your hit points, telling you about what all this stuff means, right? And here we go. Here's the alternate combat system. and the attack matrix versus, armor class. And of course, lower is better, as we all know. And armor class starts off at 9 with no armor. And then, based on, this is actually for a fighting man up here. And then, of course, you would, look at whatever the armor class is, whatever level you are, and that's the number you would need to hit on a 20-sided die. And, of course, again, this is for a fighting man, but magic users go up in steps based on 5s, and clerics in steps of 4. And normal men are equal to first-level fighters. All attacks which score hits, of course, do 1d6 damage, like we were talking about earlier. Now, monsters here have their own attack matrix, and here's that, based on the hit die of the monster. Here's the saving throws. So the saving throw matrix, and of course, these are the classic saving throws that we all know and love from, AD&D and whatnot. And there's a little bit of interpretation in how to use saving throws. Of course, I think most people just kind of extrapolate what they know from future editions of D&D. But it is worth noting, I will say this. So if you're getting into original D&D, I would pretend like you're looking at a new game, because there are things in here that are not the same as AD&D or BXD&D or whatnot. And some of your knowledge of what you think you know about D&D, some preconceived knowledges, are not necessarily true in original D&D. So I would just, if you are going to look at original D&D, and by all means, please do, pay attention to the differences. And of course, I'm trying to point out as many as I can remember off the top of my head. So here's the spells. And they go up to 6th level for a magic user and 5th level for a cleric. And you can see here there's a lot of quintessential spells that are missing, like Magic Missile, for example. It's not in here. That will get introduced later in Greyhawk. But a lot of the quintessential spells are here that we all know and love. Charm Person and Sleep and Detect Magic. And Wizard Lock and Invisibility, and Fireball, of course, is here, and Lightning Bolt, and Slow and Haste, Water Breathing, and of course, even Invisible Stalkers in here. So, not all the spells are in here, but of course, they give you options to make up your own spells at the end of the book. So that's not really a problem, and it'd be easy enough to port over whatever other spells you want. Though I would recommend just playing with these spells to begin with, playing the game as it's presented, and then making changes from there, of course. Here's the Turn Undead, and the classic Turn Undead table, and descriptions of spells, which some of these are a little different. But overall, they're basically the same as you would see in later versions of D&D. Here's a really goofy picture of an orc. I love this. The beautiful witch in the Amazon. Excellent. Very cool. Goblin, I guess. This has always been a funny one to everyone. The supposed goblin. Which I think this is some of that bootleg art we were talking about that some teenager traced from a comic book. I think this is one of them. The elf, which is not an elf at all. It's a dwarf, again, which he looks pretty cool. Magical research, here we go. It's talking about, making up your own spells and how much it costs. Books of spells. This is another thing that is up to interpretation. It doesn't say that clerics don't have books of spells. So some people actually play with clerics having books of spells. Of course, I think most people don't do that, but it doesn't say that, so, it's up for interpretation or whatever. And the backsplash page. And look at that. We went through Men in Magic. Again, this is the second time I've gone through Men in Magic with some of you guys. So, yeah. I hope you guys have enjoyed this look at Men in Magic. Let me know what you think of original D&D. I'm going to leave some links in the description if you're further interested in D&D, and some other resources you can look at. And let me know, if you guys are enjoying this, because, well, either way, I'm going to continue whether you like it or not. I'm going to keep doing it. So we're going to keep talking about original D&D. Next week, we're going to look at Monsters and Treasure. This of course, this is the second time I'll be doing that, but that's fine. But I think I'm also, and I said this last time and wasn't able to either, but I'm going to try to cram in both of these books at the same time, but we'll see how it goes. We might have to do 2 separate videos, because actually the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures does have a lot of interesting things in there that are really worth taking a look at. So we might spend a little bit more time talking about that one than I think we will. So anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this overview of booklet 1 of the White Box, the original version of D&D. And a great way to kick off the 50th anniversary of D&D. And yeah, hope you guys have a good week. We'll see you later. Y'all have a good night. Peace.